Welcome, everybody, to episode 134 of Axioms on Trial. Today, we'll be discussing trans issues, trans kids, with a professional and expert in the field. So, I'm going to bring Cass on. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
I really appreciate it. I think we met on TikTok, and what I really appreciate the content that you're putting out, and they, I think, spreading really good education. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think there's more misinformation than there is an accurate portrayal of these issues. Sometimes I feel like even people on our side sometimes
Yeah.
don't do a good job at actually communicating what the academia and the science says about these topics. And so I think it's great that you're there doing what you're doing, and I wanted to bring you on and talk to you. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Why
I
don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself? Um,
I would love to. For the sake of the viewers, you can call me Kat. I am a licensed professional counselor. I have a license somewhere in the US, and I practice mostly child therapy, multiple different modalities, usually including some very familiar ones like CBT. I typically utilize play therapy, emotion focused therapy, and yeah, now gender affirming care kind of embeds itself into that, if that makes
right. And so, what has your experience been like working with kids, um, especially trans kids? Like, what is that, and what is also um, the strategies that I think would be useful for my audience to hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh gosh. So working with kids generally is such an amazing, powerful experience. I think that kids are often not given enough credit for how much they already know at
Yeah,
very young ages. Yeah, like, whenever you see a 6-year-old that you're thinking to yourself, wow, that's an old soul.
right,
Um, Kids are incredible in that way. Generally speaking, working with kids is it's powerful to watch kids overcome obstacles. And what I do notice is that trans kids in particular tend to have more difficulty than really any other kids I've worked with in terms of getting over these hurdles, because it's usually so many issues compounded
yeah.
on things like gender dysphoria. And what was the second part of your question?
Yeah, the second part was, what strategies have you discovered are useful in navigating this kind of dynamics?
Absolutely. So I am of the mind that the best therapy is going to be radical acceptance. It's one of a few different kind of phrases that Carl Rogers talks about when he talks about psychotherapy that's meant to be deeply relational and client centered, client focused. So, in order to do that as a clinician, you need to allow yourself to drop your own motive and to be entirely there for this other person's experience, and where they want to go is where we go. If I start leading, it inevitably can start to feel like, especially for kids, very immediately, like I am basically diverting them away from what's actually important. So inevitably, radical acceptance and unconditional positive regard are these major pillars to how I respond as a therapist in general.
What
These,
would what would you say to the criticisms specifically from the conservative right that uh, this is a trend that accepting delusions only feeds those illusions, that this is a plot from the medical field to make money off of mutilating children, things of that nature.
part.
What do you say?
I think that I think that people's words have a ripple effect, and regardless how ignorant the person is, they need to take ownership of the impact that they have on the world when they say these things, especially on platforms. Um, as far as is it influenced? Is it a trend, a fad? I think that what I tend to notice is that trans kids gravitate towards trans kids. So typically, when a parent has that question for me, hey, is this like a fad that's going on in the friend group? I'm like, no, on the contrary, they found their people.
Right.
only ones in the entire school that are also trans, you know? So it's like, well, of course they're friends, you know, it has nothing to do with this. And as far as influence, I think just at a baseline level, I think it's just kind of comical. Anyone who sat with a child and tried to tell them who they are or what to do knows exactly why that's comical, because it's virtually impossible unless you are, I mean, consistently and repeatedly drilling into them that they aren't going to be acceptable unless they believe this.
Yeah, the same people will say things like kids are so easily impressionable,
Yeah,
but then it's like that's really not how that works for the most part. Like
yeah,
you're not going to be able to tell even someone that age who they are if they're not that person.
yep,
Yeah, I find it so the whole conversation about kids infuriates me because I these people that are saying these things I don't think actually give a shit about children.
right,
I think that it's a virtue signal and a talking point to justify their bigotry and
totally.
to actually dismiss their own kids and putting those same kids in more danger.
Hmm.
That's yeah,
Yeah, I feel like it shows up even in just a lot of parent-child relationships I see where, you know, you have a parent with these, you know, narcissistic tendencies or, you know, dare I say even a diagnosable disorder, and they have uh, this incessant need for control over their children as though they're property, as though, you
right,
know, really just about having a semblance of control over really anything because we have so little in life. So when we have a child or even a pet, it's like, yeah, now we finally have, you know, this being that we get to have full authority over. And it's really sad because they have no concept of what they're doing to their children until their children are no longer around.
right.
And the sad truth. So many of these trans kids that don't receive that acceptance from their parents end up staying as far away as possible when they finally have the chance. And what no parent would want that. No child wants that.
Have you been successful as far as dealing with some parents that maybe didn't understand what was going on and maybe warmed up to the reality of the situation, or do you meet a lot of pushback?
You know, it's interesting because the pushback has come a lot more over the course of the last year. I have parents that are tuning into these incredibly controversial live debates on, you know, trans rights. Are they reasonable or not? I mean, it's just horrible. So parents will come to me after listening to these more transphobic laws, and they'll say, "This is what I heard, though," and
Mm,
it's actually incredibly difficult to try and explain to them that just because you heard it from somebody on TikTok that's
right,
relevant in
yeah,
terms of treatment, in terms of the real experience. I think inevitably though, it always comes down to empathy for their kid. If there is something really significant going on, like so many of these kids end up hospitalized with suicidal ideation, self-harm, that's when the parents really start waking up when they see
right,
this of it and they're like, whoa, okay, so there's actually endless possibilities for what I'm willing to do in this moment to save my kid.
right. Right.
So yes and no. There's been a spectrum of experiences, but
Uh, what would you say are some general misconceptions about the trans community that you've encountered?
so first one is that being trans means you have medically transitioned. That one feels like a big one to mention. I think, especially when it comes to kids, because that's a huge misconception for parents when you know their kid says, "I would like gender affirming care," because they're like, "What does that mean? Does that mean
Right,
14-year-old automatically wants these things?" And the answer is not always yes. So you know, there's that. I think that I have a lot to say about the mental health realm in general as far as diagnosis, but I'll leave that for a second. And really, the other piece that gets to me is something we already touched on, which is whether it can be influenced, the brain development. So, just to give you a little fuller perspective into that, a lot of people say that the brain doesn't stop fully developing until the age of 25. There's a truth to that. It is the frontal cortex, however. It is responsible for reason, judgment, impulsivity. So when you have a teenager, naturally, they have a very impulsive brain. Daniel Siegel has a lot of amazing books on this. It's called like Brain Power, Teenage Brain. And, you know, it's really just talking about the reason why kids and teens will just kind of do stuff and they don't really think it through. So, like, I can hear the logic from people on that end saying, well, they don't have the ability to not be impulsive. However, what they're not understanding is that by 6 to 10 years old, a child has solidified concretely their identity. And that from there, it's just a matter of whether or not they spend enough time, being assessed to remove the potential for impulsivity. Like years of assessment with a therapist and doctors and specialists, that's not an impulsive act on their part if they're then seeking medical treatment.
Yeah.
So that one, and then diagnosis in general. I feel like we could go down an entire rabbit hole talking about just delusion,
Right.
different diagnoses.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that even if a person doesn't have their identity solidified necessarily, who cares?
Right.
Like if they recognize that certain things are true about their experience,
Mhm.
it's nobody else's place to tell them that that's not true. And just because somebody is going through these experiences doesn't mean that you jump to surgery.
Right.
I think any trans person, kid or adult, should go to an extensive psychiatric
Mhm.
analysis and background to figure out, okay, what kind of care do I specifically need? Because it's going to look like different things for different people.
Yep.
Um,
It has to. Yeah.
yeah. Um, I guess one thing I want to point to too is like you mentioned, uh, one of the misconceptions is about, if you're trans, you must have transitioned. And
Mhm.
and actually, what I find the most disturbing about that is there are trans people that will use that rhetoric, that you're not really trans unless you're trans like me,
Yeah.
and that to me is the biggest hypocrisy.
Mhm. It's hard.
Um, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I feel like it falls into that trans medicalist mentality where you're not a full and complete woman unless, meanwhile, it 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 reads, like even in a lighter sense as, in high school when someone makes fun of you for not having the coolest shoes that are out. And it's like, well, I would love to be as cool as you, but maybe I can't afford them, or maybe I don't have access to them. Maybe I'm not allowed, like for whatever reason, like this experience of gender goes so far beyond that. It's who you are. I mean, it's not just getting bullied for a pair of shoes you can't get a hold of. It's being told on a daily basis, your very skin doesn't look right. It makes people
Right.
uncomfortable. How could you?
It, it's especially when it comes to people who should know better, like people of the community. It just feels like history repeating itself and the same kind of lack of empathy and lack of critical thinking, where
Yeah.
they'll use the same talking points that TERFs used against trans women.
Yep.
Then they'll use that against non-binary people.
Hmm.
Um, and
Or so.
I had a trans woman the other day tell me to pick a side, tell me that she's the blueprint for what it means to be trans. I'm like, you're delusional. That is the delusion. Is thinking that because you have a particular lived experience, that means that has to be the experience for everybody else.
Right. Mm.
Um,
I notice a lot of allistic opinions on both sides of those debates too. Very this or that. There's no, gray area where it's like actually you could be like I feel like non-binary and gender fluid people represent that gray area. And it's
100%.
interesting how those topics are never super central, when in a trans debate, let's say. That's never really the topic. I mean, obviously, maybe for engagement purposes, right? People want an audience. But
Right.
still, it's interesting because it's often spoken about as being too hard to understand.
Which is so. I think it's so simple. Like,
Me.
I've met a lot of people that will say things like, "This language system is incoherent," or "You tell me what you're not, but not what you are." It's like, no, actually, you're not listening because you don't want to listen. You have this dogmatism. You've already decided what is true, and no matter what information I give you, you're just going to reject it. Like, I came out as non-binary about a year ago,
That's
right?
awesome.
And for me, the definition is very simple.
Hmm.
I understand to be trans to mean you have an incongruence with the sex you were born with.
Yep.
And gender dysphoria exists on a spectrum. And
100.
being that it's on a spectrum, if you're not on the most extreme point on the spectrum, where you would be a trans medicalist in the sense of actually getting surgeries done and all of that. You might be someone that's less on that spectrum,
Mhm.
who might present androgynous, or might present sort of what I think I do, which is sort of an embracing of both extremes of masculinity and femininity.
Mhm.
Um, I wear this breastplate as a way to navigate my dysphoria.
Mhm.
If I could get surgery, I probably would, but that's one of those things where there are risks involved, and I certainly cannot afford it right now. It doesn't mean that I'm not trans just because I can't afford a surgery, right? And so what I think is crazy is that these people will say things like, "You're mocking women, you're mocking the trans community, you're wearing us as a costume," and it's like, no, I'm living my life the way that makes me feel the most congruent with my body, and you're making it about yourself because you're insecure
Yeah,
and can't cope with your life.
right. And to your point, sexualizing, right? Not acknowledging you just being a person. It's like it, whew, the rabbit hole. But I feel like it's people like Deborah So that make that conversation so much more toxic over time. When you have someone super intellectual who knows the science behind these things, but then embeds these very turf like ideas, it makes it difficult for people to see it for what it really is.
Right.
You can't discern well. And, at the end of the day, to me, what I always express to my clients' parents above all else is that affirmation causes no harm. Period. End of story. The only harm that you cause is when you start to question or not affirm, not to be confused with validate. It's really that simple. So for you as a human being to say, to another human being, hey, I think that you're just putting on a costume. I think you're faking it. I think you're lying. All of these other things. When the alternative was to just be kind and affirm someone, feeling good again, as a human, I can't understand where people are lost in that. Like they
Yeah. And it's so disingenuous because like last night, for those who might be listening to this conversation who don't know, I'm very active on TikTok, and there are a lot of conservative creators on there that I think spread a lot of transphobic misinformation. And I debated somebody on there, um, on some of the allegations that were thrown against me and just misinformation in general. And I know you said you watched part of it. One of the things that this creator, her name is Christy, said is, "Oh, I don't have a problem with trans people." And then within the same breath said, but I think a lot of people are faking it, or I just don't want them to have access to female spaces
Mhm.
because they're not really, women.
Right.
It's like, I don't have a problem with trans people. I just don't want them to have any rights, and I don't
Mhm.
want them to, uh, you know, I don't want to affirm their delusions. It's like,
Yep.
um,
Yep. I think that people like her, libs of TikTok, who is Haya, I forget her last name, but Moms for Liberty, basically.
yeah, yeah,
They all say the exact same phrases over and over again. And there's such a cognitive dissonance involved where, you could give them every fact in the world that this is legitimate, like brain scans of post-mortem people in the 50s, we're talking like 70 years ago now. They already knew that there were differences in the brain between male, female, gay man, and then trans. They already knew this, and it shows up congruent the way
yeah,
that trans people say it does for them, like congruent in terms of like, yes, my brain matches the gender that I am saying that I am, and it's just a denial of fact and then just invalidation of a human being for an audience, for
right.
click, for monetization.
Yeah, and they'll say things, "We're not bigoted," and then we'll just misgender people, or call them delusional, or call, and then they'll play the victim when they're called out to be bigots. It's like, no, I think sometimes that word gets thrown around too easily, but when it comes to a lot of people, it does apply to them.
It does.
Um, and yeah, as far as the non-binary label, for me, non-binary just means that this incongruence is not resolved by full transition, but a partial one.
Totally.
So when Christy asked me yesterday, well, if you have this incongruence, why don't you shave your beard? It's like, well, did I say I'm a trans woman? Did I say that I'm trying to align with? And by the way, there are women that have facial hair.
Right.
Like, this is the thing that's so mind-boggling to me is that this person claims to be fighting for women's spaces and women's rights, but everything about their perspective is misogynistic. Like this
Mhm.
idea that if you're less of a woman if you have facial hair
Yes.
or hair in general,
Mhm.
or that womanhood is reducible to only biology and biological functions. Like, yes, we can acknowledge the biological differences between men and women.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean that that's all that we are.
Right. Yep, exactly. And frankly, I can say that as a female who identifies as gender fluid. You know,
Mm,
the experience of womanhood is not lost on me, or femaleness, I should say, is not lost on me because I'm gender fluid. You
right.
know, the female is totally separate from my gender experience, but
Yeah.
it's I think a lot of people, they need to learn through suffering, they learn through experience, they learn through like being forced to have empathy for people in their own lives. And it's really sad that it takes that much. Yeah.
The other day, I was talking to somebody else about this, and he's another one who all he talks about is trans issues and criticizing trans people. It's like, first of all, there's a weird, in terms of psychoanalysis, to me, there's a weird compulsion. Like, what are these people? Why are they obsessed?
Hmm.
Um, and I believe that ultimately they're fetishizing trans people, feeling guilty about it, and trying to compensate for that guilt.
Totally.
Uh, but I told him, like, look, have you read any gender theory? Like, have you read these
Right.
people? And consistently, the answer was no, no, no. Well, then why the fuck should I care about what you have to say?
Right.
When I criticize religion on my platform, whether it's YouTube or TikTok, it's because I've read the scripture, I've
Right.
talked to scholars, I've read the arguments, and I can do an internal critique of those arguments because I understand them like the back of my hand. These
Exactly.
people haven't read anything, and they
Mm.
think that they're in some position of authority.
Oh,
And when
100.
I said that, his response was the most brain dead thing I think I've ever heard, which was, well, philosophers can be wrong. Uh, okay, I'm not saying that they're right. I'm saying if you're gonna say that they're wrong, show that they're wrong.
Right.
Just because they could be, science could be wrong,
Right.
right?
Right.
How is that an argument? It was incredibly stupid.
Oh, absolutely. And aside from like like the fetishization part of it, I think that there's also like it's even more sad in my opinion is that that I want to say there's a documentary. I want to say it's called White Fragility. I could be wrong though. It's basically looking into the backgrounds of, can I say problematic phrases on here? About
Yes,
Okay. So it is related to why people become Aryan Nation, neo Nazis, white supremacists. And the major reason that they find amidst all of these young, white, cis, hetero men is that they're all lacking connection in their lives, literal human social connections. They cannot make friends. They cannot maintain healthy relationships. They're not close with their families. They feel a deep pit in their stomach that is empty, and they seek the first person who's going to say, hey, you've got purpose here,
yeah,
you're special, you're important. And it's like, well, of course now they're on the bandwagon, and it was all for the sake of community, a community.
right.
And instead of doing the work to be a part of the whole, to be inclusive, no, they would like to still.
Because it's easier to just hate as opposed to, yeah. Um, Going back to what you were saying about the sexualizing, it people that come from a place of purity culture are both so disturbed by most things sexual, but also over sexualize everything,
Yes.
over sexualize bodies, over sexualize actions.
Mhm.
Like, I was telling you before, like, I've been accused of engaging in a fetish publicly because I occasionally will wear a dress that shows cleavage, right? And it's like, if a woman walks by me and she shows cleavage,
Mhm.
I'm not assuming that she has a better relationship with her father. I'm not assuming she's doing it for attention. I'm not assuming that that um, I'm entitled to her body. I'm not assuming um, that gives me a reason to um, you know make a pass at her,
Right,
right? Because I don't objectify her,
right.
but they do. Like that's their view of bodies, and so because they can't imagine people not having that relationship with these concepts, they then have to project that onto me.
Totally.
And especially now that I'm a male doing it, well, they can't possibly wrap their heads around the fact that this couldn't be a sexual thing.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, it's like if I'm doing a live about why I don't think Jesus resurrected, or I'm playing piano, just because I'm in a dress doesn't
Right,
mean that I'm like aroused in public. Like, what the fuck?
right.
It's absurd.
Absolutely absurd, and I loved that you made that. It was huge. It was a huge point to make in that moment because that's exactly what it is. You know, why else would there be that concern? Why else would anyone look that hard? I feel like there's like an interesting somewhere in the spectrum of human existence, a good way of minding your business. Of course, maybe having a bad way of minding your business, like, you kind of just ignore something that's problematic. But generally, minding your business feels like, something people just don't do very often anymore. They don't allow people to just live their lives and make choices for themselves. It's like constant judgment. And it's become like, I just recently, it just keeps dawning on me that some of those spaces end up feeling so much like the Maury show or like a Jerry Springer episode, where it's just, that this regurgitated hatred.
Yeah, and like I said, none of them actually engage with the arguments. They'll just bully. It'll be like 5-on-1, and I mean, I've been asked a question before I can even answer, I'm being interrupted.
Hmm.
And it's like I'm at a point now where I'm just not even going to bother engaging in spaces like that because it's a waste of time. They're not interested in a real dialogue.
Right.
I'm curious because you said you're gender fluid. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience coming to that realization and what that was like for
Oh,
you?
yes. It's still kind of a new journey for me. It was about like 2018, 2019, somewhere around there. So maybe like 5 years ago. So to give you a little background, I went to a very Buddhist and like the ideology, like kind of embedded in the university I went to for being a therapist, is Buddhist in nature. So a lot of heavy philosophy and spirituality sort of, exploration, transpersonal psychology, somewhere in that process, and specializing in art therapy, there were just these very impactful projects that we would do for ourselves, really to get a sense of how powerful art therapy can be for a client and how to hold them through that. And this one project I was working with was butterflies. And I just, I had this whole thing in mind. I really needed to show the butterfly. And for whatever reason, it was always flat. It was always on a page. It didn't move. And my supervisor being, or excuse me, my professor being brilliant, he had encouraged me to let it become three-dimensional. And once
Mm,
it said, it's not about butterflies anymore. It's about the cocoon itself. I'm not out yet. I'm still this primordial goo that's melted inside there that has no form really yet.
mm,
And maybe that's okay. Maybe that gets to be what I focus on. So through that process, I realized, wow, this is very parallel to these feelings I've been having related to my gender, where it doesn't feel necessarily fully formed or fully experienced, kind of like what you were saying earlier. Maybe there are some alterations to myself that can help alleviate that dysphoria I have, but I've
mhm.
always definitely felt like no matter what I do, whether it's present more feminine, more masculine, there is no perfect comfort. So
Right.
very uncomfortable thing, but also something that I feel very it feels very simple to me, you know? It doesn't feel like I need to have, like, a long conversation beyond that, you know?
And that's the thing that I think it also enrages me when having those conversations on those platforms, like the entitlement of people thinking that you owe them a kind of gender expression. It's like, I don't owe you a fucking thing.
Right.
Like I will express how I want when I want, and if it makes you uncomfortable, that's your problem, not mine.
100%. That's
Um,
patient, like,
yeah,
they're from being authentic to themselves, you know, and it's evident. It's especially evident, you know, in some of those creators that have that kind of, you know, stereotypical kind of look to them, you know, it's like
yeah,
cookie cookie cutter. There's
yeah.
no sense of self, you know?
Yeah,
Just
I
what
mean, the irony. I've had people call me inauthentic for doing what I'm doing. It's like the irony of that statement. It's like I I would be inauthentic if I was to change what I did based on the comments of some internet stranger.
Mhm.
Like that would be inauthentic.
Right.
It's just so weird.
And
What has your sort of expression of fluidity been like? Like what has that been for you?
it has been a journey. Hmm. I wanna share things that might not necessarily be the most appropriate if, like, a
You're
kid
fine.
stumbled upon this, but
Yeah,
it
you
yeah, so my partner at the time was, hmm, interested in me exploring. They were interested in seeing where I was gonna go with things, and, um, thanks to him, I got to experience so many things I would have never thought to. Like, I had never even thought that I could Google the word phalloplasty. I was like,
mm,
"Am I allowed to Google that
right.
word? Does that mean something bad about me?" And I was so exhilarated just looking that up with him, looking up a website where you can get these prosthetics. They're not even meant for, you know, any significant usage necessarily,
Right.
more so for the experience of feeling that congruence similar to your chest plate.
Yeah.
And like, yes, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that, you know, because I've also had the experience of being with, you know, a very open partner, that I've been able to have those gender roles switch, and
Yeah.
I really embody that. And that usually feels like enough for me. It's very moment to moment too. So
Sure.
I've cut my hair very short before, but then those days where I feel like I really want to be feminine, I'm really upset because
Yeah.
man, there's no hair. But then my hair's long. I'm like, well, shit, you know. So I currently I keep a little shave side. That's like
Where you can
my
always pull your hair back when you need to,
yes.
and have it look shorter.
Yes, 100%. I started buying myself suits and not dresses, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah, just any which way that I could have both. That it doesn't have to be neither or, you know, I can wear pink. I could wear no,
Mm.
you know, something completely separate from that. So, yeah.
Yeah. I really can relate to what you're saying, because I feel like my journey has been similar, both in terms of sort of the experience of different gender roles and I think sexual roles,
Mhm.
but also in terms of uh, my own kind of embodied experience. And this goes back to like this idea that these people don't care about children because they're fighting to have education kept out of schools,
Mhm.
out of again thinking that this is somehow harms children when in reality protects them.
And can
Um,
I just say really quickly on that
yeah,
too, the ridiculousness of thinking that a child with internet access is not already well learned
yeah,
topics, even just from their friends. Do you want their friends to teach them about these words, or do you want, you know, I don't know, call me crazy, someone with a master's degree and a
yeah.
teaching to it?
Yeah, it's such an anti-education, anti-intellectual, anti-facts. That's the other irony. The so-called facts over feelings crowd, they're entirely in their feelings. It's exhausting. But yeah, what I was gonna say was that it sounds like your experience of coming out has been a recent one. Mine, even a more recent one, probably within just the last couple of years. Had I had access to that education from, uh, you know, from a kid, from a from when I was a kid, it would have prevented, you know, 15, 16 years, maybe more, of confusion.
Totally.
Uh, I mean, I thought that this feeling of discomfort in my body was what everybody felt, that it was just the normal way to feel. That was
Yes.
standard. And it wasn't until, um, obviously, even before realizing where I was at,
Mhm.
I was a complete supporter of the community.
Mhm.
Um, but it was in those conversations that I started to realize, oh shit, I'm in the same boat here. Like,
Right.
I understand what they're saying.
Yes.
And then once I started to experiment and got the breastplate, like, now it all clicked. Now it all makes sense.
100%.
And I'm 34. It took me 32 years, 33 years to.
We're we're the same age. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yep, 100%. I think the best thing that I ever got to have when I was a teen was access to HBO and watching it late at when
Yeah.
everyone was asleep, and I got to I got to watch, like, Taxi Cab Confessions.
I was just gonna ask you about that. I was
Right.
just gonna ask you about that. That show had such an impact on my life. Holy
Yeah.
shit, that's
It
amazing.
it opens my eyes to all of these, taboo kind of topics and how completely fucking normal they are for so many people. Just
Yeah.
behind closed doors or just, not in plain sight, I should say. But oh my God, to see a couple where there's a trans woman and, this cisgender man sitting with her and
Yeah.
he's just got this very blasé sort of attitude about it. Like, the cab driver's like inquisitive and
Yeah.
curious. And he's like, I'm so in love. She's beautiful, isn't she?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, the humanity. Ah, this is something I connect with. I wonder why. But
Oh,
hey, that
20, like 10 years later, 15 years later. Now, oh, yes, now I get it. I'm so glad you brought it up because no joke, I will think about the show at least, like, every 3 days.
yes,
Like,
so good.
I was obsessed with that
Mhm.
show.
Yes,
Um, Now I wanna go back and find it online and see if I can rewatch it.
me too. I think.
But yeah, that was amazing.
Yep. I mean,
Um,
it also brings to mind how, a lot of people on the opposing side also say that this is something that's only been covered in media in the last few years. And I'm like, I beg to differ. Things like Law and Order SVU were creating episodes on trans rights about 25 years ago.
mm,
Like Taxi Cab Confessions was, a show literally about taboo subjects. So you were going to get exposed to anything that they could think of that week, so yeah, just kind of yeah, it blows my mind. There's so much access for people to see these things. Yeah.
the other thing that people say or have said about me a lot is, kind of dismiss the idea of that I have dysphoria and just called me an AGP,
Ew.
which I don't know. I forget the specific word of that, what that means, but
Yeah.
right. And how would you define that?
Oh, so it's basically defined as a born male who, for sexual gratification, modifies his body to look like a woman for sexual pleasure and gratification, not because there's a gender incongruence.
Right. Now, that is completely not my experience whatsoever. It isn't a sexual thing. And also, I don't identify in any way as a woman. So it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I don't think that there is something inherently wrong with somebody who is that,
Me
right?
neither. Yeah.
Um, and as long as they're not doing it in a way that is like violating people's consent, and that doesn't mean that, look, if they're walking around dressed a certain kind of way, as long as they're not in the nude,
Right.
like,
Or like pleasuring themselves in public,
yeah, it's like,
you know.
yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. And
Mm.
it just
Yeah.
the other thing too is, like, are these people expecting a person never to be aroused in their gender expression either? Like, not that
Thank
one causes the other, but it's like, well, is that person just supposed to be celibate
Mm.
when, like, how's that make sense? You know what I mean?
I feel like, as a person who loves to love myself,
Yeah,
way, I feel like that's what it is. It's an act of loving yourself. So, like, let's say for me, gender fluid, if I find a prosthetic that really fits me, like I've seen some and I'm like, oh my gosh, that would be the one. That would be the
right,
one. You know, I'm like, wow, I would feel so turned on by myself after
yeah,
getting to things, not because it was something sexual, but because I was excited at the idea of getting to experience myself fully. You
right.
know, only experienced some of myself thus far, as it turns out.
And even if it was a sexual thing,
Right.
that's not something to judge or call a perversion. Nobody's being hurt here.
Right.
This is the whole purity culture. And when I was talking with Christy, who kept denying it, that it was about purity culture, and then in the same breath saying, I think that sex work shouldn't exist, or
Right.
that I think that the people that wear certain kind of things are devaluing themselves. Now that is purity culture.
Yes.
If you're devaluing somebody's entire existence because of their work or because of how they present their body, that is purity culture.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure at some point she ran topics, maybe not body count, but things similar to that. And it's like,
Yeah,
oh, what body count is too high kind of topics.
yeah,
And oh my gosh, like, of course, it's so obviously misogyny to me,
yeah.
and she sees it as feminism.
Right. That's the thing. That's the warped
Yeah,
view of that, where she thinks she's defending women. The
I
other thing in the conversation, right, where she was saying, "Well, men are never going to change," and
right,
because I was saying we need to raise a culture of men that have empathy, that are not objectifying women. She's
yeah,
saying, "Well, that's never going to happen, and so we have to keep males out of all
right,
spaces."
right. We need to continue, validating that men get to be predatory,
Right. Exactly.
like normalizing it,
No
seeing
more. Yeah.
the self-blame cycle of like, oh right, I did it to myself because I shouldn't have gone to the bathroom wearing a short skirt that day, I guess.
Right.
Oh, yep. The whole thing is so warped. And like, I don't think that people like this understand, whether it's her or, Hala. I don't think that they understand how many young people are watching these things as they're happening. Like, TikTok might be, X age up for certain content. That doesn't mean children don't lie. Like,
Right.
of course they're going to watch these things. My young clients watch these things, and you bet that it affects their mental health. And then they kind of have this, well, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and stop taking it so personally attitude. And it's
Right.
not to the 11-year-old with zero coping skills who's at the
Right.
beginning journey of understanding themselves, and here you are telling them that they're not only invalid but they're an abomination.
Right. Yeah, and which is why I am so thankful and grateful for people like you that you're you
Yeah.
know trying to at least be a counterweight to that. I think we need more people like you
Hmm.
to be doing the work. I don't think there's enough.
Totally.
And I'm trying to do what I can to spread I think the right message. I get worried about the people on our side that only say things like, "Well, gender is just a social construct, and anybody can be anything."
Hmm.
That's going to be a confusing message that people are not going to be able to understand, and I don't think it's the accurate message to portray. And so, you know,
Hmm. Yeah, and to be honest, I think that there's also the issue of sugarcoating the science a little bit on, the left. It's
yeah,
like they really want to make it sound better than it does. And it's like, we've done these postmortem scans of the brain, right? Yes, we've done that. Have we done it on a very large, you know, uh, amount of people? No.
yeah, right,
We done, thousands upon thousands of times over the last few decades? No. So, there are information's, research plot holes that we are slowly filling in as time goes on. Anything to do with psychology, biology, it gets complex quick. And,
yeah,
you're talking about a lot of money in research, a lot of people, now politically banging on the door saying, don't you dare do that research, or like whose biases are going to be a part of this research.
Right.
And
Right.
it doesn't get done, or it doesn't happen the way that we really need it to get done. So, what I ask of people is to allow science the time to catch up, so to speak, and adding more and more information to this book of knowledge we have about
Right.
gender. In time, we know enough to know that it, regardless, to me, it doesn't matter how you
Right.
identify. Affirmation is what heals. You
Yeah.
know, any form of resistance from me is quite literally the opposite of what a therapist should do. And I
Right.
guess I would say this as like a little, just something to think about for therapists in general. I think that most therapists know that if they don't have the experience working with this community or the experience themselves, to stay away from it, to refer out to appropriate providers. I think that there are, I would imagine, a lot of therapists out there that would like to be able to, but I think that there's a deficit in actual practice experience where they're concerned that they're not going to do it the way they need to. And that's fine. That's fine. I mean, maybe eventually they'll feel more comfortable and we will have more providers that feel super comfortable with, just gender affirmation as a whole. But, I think the real problem to me, just a little call out, is for all those therapists hiding and lurking out there that are not for this, that, pretend to do this work, because therapists inevitably have an ethical obligation to sit with whoever sits in front of them and hold compassion and space for that. So
Right.
any invalidation or bigotry or bias or conversion therapy is unethical, despicable. Shame on you, and please
Yeah.
don't be a therapist anymore.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
I completely echo that sentiment. Um, I was going to ask something. I'm trying to remember what it was. While I think about it, is there anything else? Oh no, I remember now. Are there any books or gender theorists or literature that you think my audience would benefit in looking up and reading?
Okay, so there's a book that's like fairly specific to the autistic experience. However, it is written by a non-binary therapist named Dr. Devon Price. Uh, oh gosh, I might have to like Google really quickly what it's called, but they only have one book out. I think it's called Unlearning or Unmasking Autism, I believe. So that's a really great book. As far as like gender theory books, things like that, I don't really have any huge recommendations, but I would always recommend that parents read into um, Lisa Dion's work. She's huge in play therapy. Play therapy is shockingly, incredibly clinical, by the way. So fascinating stuff, an amazing way to really talk to kids about what's going on, including trans kids. It's very universal in that way. And then also, oh gosh, not Lisa Dion. Oh gosh, I just had the other name in my mind. Uh, Daniel Siegel. Please look them up. He has a lot of books. They're all amazing, specific to brain development, specific to child brain development, for parents out there that are looking to understand things on that neurological level. I think that those are really cool resources to have. And like I said earlier, because I go through like, because the modalities I practice are things like CBT, emotion focused therapy, this unconditional positive regard and client centered work, all things combined. Any literature related to those topics is going to be helpful in understanding yourself and gender, because inevitably the more that you can accept yourself, the deeper into yourself you get to go. So from there, it's purely about, yeah, just finding that love for yourself.
Sure. And I think one connection that I think science has been making recently is the connection between autism and some of this gender spectrum.
Sure.
And that definitely makes sense to me because I'm definitely on
Yeah.
the autistic spectrum, and I think that that definitely rang true when I heard that. I was like, oh, this makes even more sense to me now.
Mhm. Yeah, there's, to my understanding, there's not enough clinical research to show that it's an absolute correlation. Like, yes, most trans people are autistic, let's say.
Sure, sure.
But it is fascinating to know that so many people on the spectrum have a much easier time. Funny, because a lot of people on the spectrum tend to be very rigid in certain like thought processes, but when it comes to gender, they're typically extremely confused by the idea of the very, rigid,
Essentialist.
right,
Yeah,
binary roles that they have to fit into this box of because there's so much happening. They're like, no, no,
right,
no, I fit into like 100 different boxes at once. Do you want to see them all? You know,
right, right.
so it makes total sense to me. Like, yeah, you feel like you can access more of yourself to know yourself and be comfortable
Yeah,
to fit in a box. So
absolutely. Um, we're about to hit the 1 hour mark shortly, but I was wondering, is there anything else that you think that our audience should hear about, what you do or what you're fighting for and all those things?
totally. Ooh, do you mind if I monologue for a couple?
Please, please go ahead.
Yes. Okay, first and foremost, kiddos who are trans, I mean, I'm not discounting the experience of other children experiencing suicidal ideation. In fact, what I want to tell you, just to give you a little not so fun fact, at the height of the pandemic a few years ago in the state of Colorado, that children's hospital, they did a study to see, uh, there's been a rampant mental health crisis, or should I say, more people seeking care when they got to stay home a lot. And so, in that experience, Children's Hospital realized that 4 times as many children at that point were expressing suicidal ideation and requiring hospital stays. So, in general, the rate of suicidality in children has increased drastically since then.
Mm,
We have children that have lost years of social development and emotional development in that time. And you might be, working with your teens right now and they might feel a little immature to you. And you know what? It's probably because they didn't get to emotionally develop enough for those couple of years that they were
yeah,
in basic like solitude. So suicidality is no joke. It's something that I emphasize very heavily in my practice when it comes to trans clients, to their parents. And it is not a threat. It is not a thing to make you feel scared. It is a scary reality. It's not me telling you what could happen. It's typically what's already happening. So if this is what's going on for kids, they need this care. They do. Some of these kids cannot go from 12 to 17, 18 years old like some of, these people would like to receive medical treatments if necessary. I want to, dispel the misconception that most kids that are trans end up seeking medical treatment because that is not the case. They don't, and some can't, um, for varied reasons. And when it comes to suicidal ideation in trans kids, we need to take it seriously. Um, and we need to understand mental illness versus disordered behavior. So, like, one thing I would love to speak to really quickly is one other misconception, which is around delusion. This really upsets me because, as someone who has been with quite a few people who have experienced psychotic episodes, I myself have experienced psychotic episodes.
mm,
I do not appreciate people using this word Lily Valley. Like, if you don't understand that experience of having a fractured reality, then please don't speak on it in such a sense. For people who are trans, the only mental health disorder that would be related to them at any point in time is going to be gender dysphoria.
sorry, right,
It's
right.
the only diagnosis that will have any reflection on their gender identity in any which way whatsoever. That is not a mental illness, it is a disorder. Disorder meaning that your behavior is disordered. There is an impairment to your daily functioning, a disorder to it. What the DSM-4, the diagnostic book that is meant to say this is impairing your daily functioning in life. And
Right,
that's a problem because society needs you to work and do the 9 to 5 and function.
right.
So hence it being, justifiable to insurance, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't make it an illness and it certainly doesn't make it delusional. And while we're at it, just to be clear, people with psychotic tendencies do not only express delusions. They would
Right.
simultaneously express multiple symptomologies at the same time. It could include things like scattered speech, where things they say don't really make sense. It could be, multiple delusions, and they don't just, uh, they don't just box themselves into just one delusion.
Right.
It Their whole world is
Right.
filled altered reality. So,
Right.
big misconception. And then finally, BDD versus dysphoria. BDD is body dysmorphic disorder. Body dysmorphic disorder and gender dysphoria differ in that when you have gender dysphoria, you want to see change to your sex characteristics very specifically.
Right.
That's your difference. Body dysmorphic disorder is meant to be like you're looking at your body in a fun mirror, and there are very particular parts of your body, could be your teeth, could be your hairline, it could be, the way that your hip dips a certain way. These little tiny areas appear to the brain warped, and that is the difference. And it should be treated similarly and differently. All of these cases are very subjective. Every single.
And yeah, and gender dysphoria, can be towards both primary or secondary sexual characteristics.
Yeah.
There are plenty of trans people that don't feel the need to have bottom surgery,
Yep.
or might not feel the need to have top surgery,
100.
um, and they're still trans and they're still valid in their experience.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so
Yeah, and to even point out the outlier, there's also trans people that have, pursued every single area of gender affirming care, and nothing has really helped them to feel totally comfortable in their skin. And that's okay too. It's okay sometimes to feel discomfort as long as you know that people around you are being supportive and
yeah.
continue.
Another thing I find disturbing is the exploitation of the um, the detransitioners,
Mhm. Hate it.
as an attempt to undermine the trans community as a whole. Like, my heart goes out to anybody who has felt the need to detransition. Most of them, by the way, do so because of social reasons.
Yes.
But
Lack.
those that do not do that for social reasons, it's like, yeah, they're valid too in their experience.
Totally.
Nobody is discounting, but it doesn't mean that everybody else is now
Invalid.
invalid, right?
Right, right. Yeah. It's like, well, 99.6% of trans people who transition stay, or should I say remain at some point in their lives totally transitioned, like
Yeah,
within that there are detransitioners that retransition, so like 99.6% amazing. They throw in the detransitioner argument to say, well, don't leave them out. They matter too. Don't their
yeah,
experience matter? And it's like, of course they do. But when we're talking about a vast majority of this group, wouldn't it be fair to say that a vast majority deserves the rights to their health care and
yeah,
choice? Maybe detransitioners have their experience. And you know what? One thing I did read that is good to know and good to take with people that really do want to support detransitioners is that they are, I was reading the other day, far less likely to have a support system after the fact. They get shamed into corners for detransitioning and
right,
losing entire friend groups, support systems, therapies, all these different things. And they do need support. They need your support. They need their therapist. They need people to still be with them even when they detransition. So, yes, you're valid. And I would love it if you and trans people could continue to maintain your health care.
right.
So,
Yeah, exactly, 100%.
let's do
The
both.
the last thing I want to ask you is, what do you think of the talking point or the fear of so-called males entering female spaces, whether it's bathrooms, sports, things of that nature?
I have definitely a few things that I think about in regards to that because I've had my own trauma history. I feel comfortable enough to share that it is extensive. Um, so I am no stranger to the aggression, the boundarylessness of some men that exist in the world. I won't say all. I used to be very allistic in that way, but I can see the gray area that there are definitely some lovely males out there, for the sake
Hmm.
males. Um, and across the spectrum, men, are perceived as a threat by women. I understand that. I live it. I live it every single day. However, I think that for a person to perceive a trans woman as a man is A, inherently transphobic in some way. B, there's a cognitive dissonance, a lack of trust to, trust what someone's saying and to trust that there's no threat. And inevitably, what I have to say is, as a survivor of assault, you get to be a victim and you get to be a survivor. Usually, victim comes before survivor. You get to be a victim. You get to say, this happened to me. I was harmed. I'm sensitive. I'm raw. I'm vulnerable. Please, like, give me all the protections in the world. And it is our responsibility to do some of that work and healing for ourselves. I say that from the bottom of my heart. I say that so that you can become a survivor, so that, you get to be the victim who then, rises like the phoenix and is able to say, yes, I can now set really firm boundaries and I know that nothing was my fault, et cetera, et cetera. So, hypothetical situation, a woman is coming out of the bathroom stall and sees a trans woman walk in, and their immediate, it's not even their choice, their brain instinctually scans this person for information to determine who they are they a threat, are they a friendly, whatever else. They're going to see someone who, let's say, doesn't necessarily pass the way that maybe they would like to, and their brain goes, warning, warning, there's a male in your presence who might pose a threat. See, here's the thing about boundaries. Boundaries do not mean please leave. It means I'm not willing to stay where I don't feel safe. I'm going to separate myself from this. So in that moment, if there is a discomfort, you separate yourself. That is your boundary. That's you saying, I refuse to put myself in an environment where I don't feel safe. Period. End of story. The real bit, though, the thing that I think people really need to work with is, you are initially, your brain is perceiving this person a certain way, and you have the ability to logic your way through things from there. If this person is showing you completely defenseless body language, dare I say cowering, hiding their face, running to the stall, I think it's fair to say that your brain has now assessed that the threat has decreased and
Right.
that it's now time to start regulating. There comes a point where you need to regulate yourself and understand the difference between a trauma response based on previous triggers versus an actual threat. So I think that there's a lot of work, for people to do in that way. And I personally, I could not live with myself. I'd women, out there, cisgender women in particular can have their thoughts and opinions on this. I'm always willing to hear them. However, I would feel horrible if I knew that I felt discomfort with regards to anyone who came in the restroom. If I felt discomfort to the point where I said, could you please leave? And they did, and they got hurt because they were now put into a situation where they were surrounded by predatory men who are
Yeah.
statistically more likely to hurt them, not a cis woman.
Right.
How could I possibly do that? At that point, it is about the boundary of comfortability versus safety. In play therapy, it's what's called a tolerance boundary versus a safety boundary. When there's a safety boundary, that needs to be a boundary. That is non-negotiable,
Right.
not negotiable. So for a trans woman, the safety boundary is being in the women's restroom, period.
Yeah. Yeah, I think these people would say that for them the safety boundary would be to not have males in the restroom. But my my view is that we should have bathrooms that are sex based, and we should have bathrooms that are gender based or like gender fluid, or and
Neutral.
so if a person is uncomfortable with the idea of a male in the bathroom, okay, go use a sex separatist bathroom and do that. For those that are not, who don't have the discomfort, or who do not have those views, then they will be able to use a gender neutral bathroom without issues, and then everybody has the option to do whatever they want to do. And this is why I don't believe the conservatives for a second when they say that they care about these things, because when I provide a solution like that,
Yeah,
that would actually make everybody happy,
right. They
they're
say
still pissed.
right, right. I heard their response of, "Well, we're not there yet, and we won't be for a while. Let's be real. So, like, what do we do about it now?" And
Right.
it's well, now is the time where we distinguish between comfortability and safety. If statistically you are less safe in a particular bathroom than a cisgender woman, you got to honor your safety. And if that's at the risk of someone feeling uncomfortable, then that person is going to have to deal with feeling uncomfortable and set a boundary and remove themselves. I don't see it as any more complicated than that. And I don't like it when people make a scene either. I just don't think it's very, like, I know that we're not all about like old fashioned decorum and etiquette as much anymore. Like, we don't properly eat with our little utensils anymore, and like boop 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 boop. But could we please have a little decorum? you know like,
Yeah,
why are you talking to anyone that way, period?
yeah, the whole, well, we're not there yet, I think is not as though everybody, like, has to run to a public bathroom as an emergency. It's like, there are ways in which we can already, make what I mentioned a reality,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not that complicated.
Right.
So, but
It's
yeah,
really
I really wanna thank you for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
me as
Um,
you so
if you
much.
want to stick around for a minute, because I wanna, after I end this, I wanna get those book titles from you. I wanna write them down.
Totally.
But I would love to have you back at some point.
Definitely.
To talk. I don't know. Actually, I'm curious. Do you come from a religious background at all?
I was raised Catholic. Though it's like I was given the structure of Catholicism, but my mom was predominantly just kind of spiritual anyway. So there was like a fluidity to it, if that makes sense. Like we didn't have to go to church for her to know that she was in
Mm.
touch with God. She wanted me to have a relationship with that in that way, but I am deeply agnostic.
Okay, I was just curious because I talk a lot about religion on. I think
Cool.
my the two of the topics I talk about a lot are religion and
Ooh,
trans issues, and so I was just curious. But yeah, maybe we can talk about other things as well next time you come on.
totally.
So I hope everybody that listened to the conversation enjoyed it. Um, and I'm thinking that I might start uploading some of my TikTok debates and conversations on the channel sometime soon. But I will keep you guys posted on that. Yeah, I hope everybody stays safe, and thanks again.
Thank you.